You know, we've spoken in the past about these two great Arab poets. So, speaking of interactions, circles, and dynamics between people, what can be a greater example than Farazdaq and Jarir? People, if you've heard of diss tracks, which I'm sure you all have, forget about all these diss tracks and of this age and going to these rappers dissing one another, and these people haven't got anything on Farazdaq and Jarir. These were the original diss tracks. These people are from the time of the Sahaba radiallahu anhu. So they're from that time. Okay. You've got, both of them are from a tribe known as Bani Tamim. Okay. Now, so Jarir and Farazdaq, and they're from, one from Busra, is born around Busra, and the other from Najd, but they interact. So the way it works basically is everybody's rising, they're saying poetry, and they're kind of proclaiming themselves. And what happens is you see a rival and they diss them, and they start taking out their rivals one by one, and you're eventually left with just the creme de la creme, or the best of the best, and that just leaves a few. And so from amongst them you have Farazdaq and Jarir. Now, Farazdaq, by the way, was not his actual name. They call him that. His actual name was Hammam ibn Ghalib ibn Sa'sa. He was Farazdaq. It means something like a loaf of bread or something like a loaf of something, but it's because he had some kind of big face. So he's called him Farazdaq. So these two, they emerge as the kind of the best of the best. So they become opponents. Their rivalry, they start diss tracks against, dissing one another. And the energy is such, and this is by extension, it goes as a lesson for all of us. The energy is such that it consumes you. You get sucked into it. Their rivalry lasts as long as Harb al-Basus. If you remember of the Jahiliyyah pre-Islamic wars that lasted over 40 years. And they live right into their old age, into their early 90s. So for decades, they diss each other and they spare nobody. Not the other person's mum, not the other mother, not their fathers, not their sisters, not their wives. It is absolutely ruthless, no holds barred, okay, people. So it is absolutely it is tyrannical. That's how it is. People dread it, and they really have at it with each other. Jarir and Farazdaq. And so they change the style of poetry, and this is why their disses are called a naqa'id. So poetry before that was a certain style that, you al-anqad, like you stand on the ruins and you say, hey, my two companions, and then you talk about your travels, and then you either talk about women or warfare or your camel or your horse, or you talk about wisdoms. It all changed with these. They just went at it straight as soon as it starts, bang, at each other. And they really are both amongst the epic poets of their era. So you get, so as an example, what you'd get is Farazdaq. He says to Jarir, and they're going to Hajj. Allah. See, it doesn't even stop in Hajj. And he says, and this is a lesson to be learned here, when you get so much into something that's negative, that has this kind of toxicity, it consumes you that you don't realize, and you just have a momentum, and you're just going until you stop. So here they are in Hajj, and Farazdaq says to him, إِنَّكَ لَاقٍ بِالْمَشَاعِرِ مِن مِنَى, that you will be meeting someone at the Masha'ir, and in one he says بِالْمُحَصَّبِ مِن مِنَى, that at the place at the Masha'ir by Mina. فَخَارًا فَخَبِّرْنِي بِمَنْ أَنْتَ فَاخِرُ, says you're going to meet somebody that has, he has something to proclaim boastfully, meaning him. فَخَبِّرْنِي بِمَنْ أَنْتَ فَاخِرُ, who are you going to praise as your ancestors? Because you see, in Jahiliyyah time, pre-Islam, when the people would meet up at Arafat, what they would do is they would kind of boast of the tafakhur bil ansab. So the Prophet condemned this, but the Arabs, it was difficult for them to kind of give it up. And this is why in a hadith the Prophet said that my ummah won't give it up. It's that kind of tribalism. And so pre-Islam, they would stand there and they would openly say their poems, and my dad did this, and my granddad did this, and ha 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 ha, wow, that guy's such a legend, oh, he's such a legend. And so this is what Farazdaq saying to him, that إِنَّ خَلَاقٍ بِالْمَشَاعِرِ مِمِّنًا فَخَارًا فَخَبِّرْنِي بِمَنْ أَنْتَ فَاخِرُ, who are you going to praise when you meet? And the reason he's saying this is because, you see, both of them are from Bani Tamim. Bani Tamim is a huge tribe of Arabs spread right over the Middle East and into the Arabian Peninsula. And it's like a rough tribe as well. So, you see, but they've obviously come from different branches of the tribe. And Farazdaq's ancestry is actually quite boastful, as in they've actually done things. Like they really, so for example, his dad, Hammam ibn Ghalib, his dad's name's Ghalib. He was also somebody incredibly generous, incredibly kind of like known amongst his people. And his dad, Sa'sa'a, he was from pre-Islam, and I believe reaches Islam and embraces Islam. In pre-Islamic times, what Sa'sa'a would do is he would, if he found out that somebody was about to kill an infant girl, because in Jahiliyyah time, for whatever reason, often it was for poverty, they would bury the girls alive. It's the greatest sin of, humanity. That this, what they called wa'ad, is wa hamza dal, and the Quran says, إِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ, that when the girl who was buried alive will ask that why was she killed. So Sa'sa'a one day was going and he saw this kind of couple, and they were digging a ditch, and he asked them, what's this for? And they said they were going to bury their daughter, this toddler, this tiny baby, and not even a toddler, just like a newborn. And he said that, how about if I pay her ransom? Will you give her to me? And because first of all, he asks them why. And they said, faqar. They said, because of poverty. And he said, how about if I pay her ransom? And he did. And he had like a huge family clan. He would give the child, somebody would raise the child. So what he started to do was he started to go around seeking out people that were trying to, in this horrible, abominable way, abort a live child, a living child. They were trying to kill and bury alive. So he would save these maw'udat. And he saved anything between, some say, 300 to 400 girls. And may Allah bless him in his afterlife for that. That is an immense act of just courage in that time and humanity. And in a certain narration, the people say the Prophet ﷺ said about him and praised him. So you can see this ancestry is like, wow, that Farazdaq has this. So this is why he's saying that, you know, we are, and then he's got all these other ancestors that are like warriors and part, because Bani Tamim had, they were like warriors anyway. And so this branch especially, so he says in this poem, Inna alladhi samaka sama'ala, that the one who's kind of raised and built the heavens, banalana, he has made for us, baytan da'aimuhu azzu wa atwal, that Allah, who's made the heavens above, has made our household with even more grandeur. Allah. Says Baytan Zurara. This is one of his ancestors. Muhtabim bifina'ihi. Wa mujashi'un dhul fawarisu nahshalu. So he's naming his ancestors that, you know, Mujashi and Nahshal, and these guys are all dons, and these are my oh, Chaudhry Saab, whatever here, Chaudhry Saab. These are my ancestors. And he's proper like praising. This is why he's trying it on with Jarir, and but Jarir wasn't the type to kind of stay calm either. But this is what he's telling, and he says that, and it's a famous line of his, that هؤلاء آبائي فجئني بمثلهم. These are my ancestors, like these people, like Zurara, like Mujashi', like Nahshal, like Sa'sa'a, that these are my ancestors, so bring the like of them onto me. إِذَا جَمَعَتْنَا يَا جَرِيرُ الْمَجَامِعَ. That Jarir, if it ever happens that we come together in a gathering, then bring the likes of these for me. Wow, 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 wow. So this is what's kind of going on. And in their time, these two, they not only lock horns, they completely consume one another. They like so there's these two, and there's a third as well, by the way, known as Akhtal. He was a Christian. They're proper locked in. Now Jarir, just to give you an idea, why is he dissing Jarir? One, he's got his own ancestry, which is so, but Jarir, his parents were known, one, that his kind of sub branch wasn't anything special, but his parents were known for being super tight-fisted. Super miserly and stingy. That, check this. Once somebody came to Jarir's house, and he kind of knocks on his door, and he's speaking to him, and he wants to meet him. And then he starts asking him, he says, but tell me, who is Ash'arun Nas? Who is the epic poet, the Don poet of all Arabs? And because remember, when it comes to do with fakhar and praising yourself and standing your ground, and these guys are the heavyweights of their day and age. These are like the Mike Tysons, and these are the heavyweights. So Jarir says to him, he says, come with me. So he goes with him, and they go into next door into this kind of like shed. He's like following him. He goes in, and he can see this old man who's kind of all huddled up, and he's got the udder of a goat, right? And he's got his mouth on it, and he's drinking milk directly from the udder. So the guy looks at Jarir, and Jarir looks at him, at this guest, and he says, do you know who that is? And he says, who? He goes, that's my dad. And he says, it doesn't stop there. He says, do you know why he's doing that? He says, no. He says he thinks that if he squeezes, like if he milks the goat into a pan, then obviously as the milk hits the pan, it's going to make a little noise. And he's worried that the neighbors will hear that he's got milk. So he's drinking it direct. This is his own dad. So he says, he turns to the guest, and he says, if despite having a dad like that, and his dad's name's Atiyah, by the way, he says, if despite having a dad like that, I can still manage to boast in my poetry, he says, then you tell me, if somebody can pull that off, then ain't they the most done poets amongst the Arabs, if they could do that? And this is where, you know, every poem that Farazdaq would say, Jarir would always kind of come back at him. And he'd say, I would rival everything he says, I would rival it. Except, he said this one couplet to me once, which I couldn't reply. And that is where Farazdaq says to him, he says, ليس الكرام بناحليك أباهم حتى ترد إلى عطية تعتر. He says, you know, the people who are generous, even if they want to be generous to you, they can't gift you their dad. He says, you're stuck basically. At the end of the day, you're stuck with your own dad, even no matter how generous people want to be with you. And he says, وقد زعمت أنك ترضى بما بنى. He says, no, he says, وزعمت أن قد رضيت بما بنى, that you claim that you're so happy with your legacy, that he says, فاصبر فما لك عن أبيك محول. Like at the end of the day, no matter what you boast, you still have to go through your dad's lineage. And this is why they used to proper go at it. So you have once Akhtal, who's this Christian that I mentioned, and they're like the top three, and they used to all have a royal audience with the caliph. That this is how these people in their day and age were so powerful, because if they said a poem, they could ruin your career with a single line. That's how ruthless they were. Don't mistake, I mean, this Jarir, don't mistake him for, on a particular occasion, and I've mentioned this before, there was this guy called Ar-Ra'i al-Numayri from the tribe of Numayr, who took sides with Farazdaq and started saying, yeah, Farazdaq's got the upper hand. So Jarir, he just released one poem against him, where he starts by saying, عَدَّ اللَّهُ لِلشُّعَرَاءِ مِنِّي سَوَاعِقَ يَخْضَعُونَ لَهَا الرِّقَابَ, that Allah has prepared me amongst the poets that I, like a lightning bolt, they, bow their heads to me. In there, he has this line where he says to that guy, he says, فَغُدَّ الطَّرَفَ, that he says, lower your eyes, like don't look at me. إِنَّكَ مِن نُمَيْرٍ فَلَا كَعْبًا بَلَغْتَ وَلَا كِلَابًا. This one line of his, it ended the career of Numayr, who are actually quite a powerful tribe. And after that, they would be so embarrassed to say that they were Numayri. They used to refuse to say it. They would just affiliate with the higher kind of clan. This is how ruthless these poets were. So they would often meet up in the royal courtyard, and their lives got immersed in this. You see, the reason I'm highlighting this is when you get into something, that thing consumes you and gets into you. You become part and parcel of it. So Akhtal, he disses Akhtal as well on so many occasions. And he says to him on Jarir, says to him even about, because he's a Christian, he disses him about being a Christian, and he disses him, and he says, praising the caliph, that the caliph's like my cousin. If I wanted, this actually annoyed Abdul Malik, the king at the time, caliph, because he says, هذا ابن عمي في دمشق خليفة لو شاء, he says لو شئت ساقكم إلي قطينا. And I think I've mentioned this story before. He says, if I wanted, he would drag you to me like sheep, and because you Christians and blah blah blah. He kind of makes this, even though Akhtal was highly respected in the royal court. This thing, he wasn't, even though he was a Christian, he used to say what he wanted to say, and he was like an epic poet. And he says about Jarir as well, dissing this stinginess. Check this. And I think I may have cited this before. He says that if guests came to their home, he says, قوم إذا استنبح الأضياف كلبهم. قالوا لأمهم بولي على النار. That if they find out guests are coming to their house because the dog starts barking, they tell their mom, urinate over the fire so we don't have to cook anything. And so this is what they're telling their mom. So just in case the guests think, oh, mashallah, they've got a burning fire, you know, they're going to put some food on for us. So they say, buli ala nari. Says, فَتُمْسِكُ الْبَوْلَ بُخْلًا أَن تَجُودَ بِهِ فَمَا تَبُولُ لَهُمْ إِلَّا بِمِقْدَارِ. That the mother, she, even then, like she's conflicted because she wants to urinate and put the fire out, but then she's so stingy that even when she urinates, she does so in the stingy way that she only urinates the right amount to put the fire out. This is the kind of tracks that these people are releasing on one another. And check this out, right? So what happens is, and Jarir, by the way, doesn't kind of go easy on the others either. He says to Farazdaq, like this, check this is an example. Farazdaq's dad, Ghalib, had been killed by someone called Zakwan ibn Amr. And that's a different story. Somebody, they actually, I think they dissed this person and he came back and he killed him. So he says in this poem, he says, فَلَمْ يَبْقَى فِي سَيْفِ الْفَرَزْدَقِ مَحْمَلُ. He says there's nothing, you know, that Farazdaq's sword is kind of useless. He says, وَفِي سَيْفِ ذَكْوَانِ ibn Amr مَحَامِلُ. He says, whereas, you know, the sword of Zakwan ibn Amr, look at that, he's winding him up. That's the guy that's killed his dad. He says, yeah, that's still, you know, that's where it's happening. And he says to him, he says in that, he says, he has this line where he says, وَيَرْضَعْ, that he would like basically suckle, that Farazdaq, this grown man, would suckle for food. He says, يَرْضَعْ كُلَّ مَنْ لَاقَى وَإِنْ يَلْقَى مُقْعَدًا. He says, this guy is so destitute. This is what he's saying to Farazdaq, that if he saw anybody, he would try to suckle their nipples. He says, even if it was a disabled person, مُقْعَدًا. يَقُودُ بِعَعْمَى فَالْفَرَزْدَقُ سَائِلُ. He says, even if the guy is disabled, who not only is he disabled, he's being led by a blind person. So he says, imagine this, a disabled person who's being carried by a blind person. Now these two come past Farazdaq. Farazdaq would still beg from them. This is the kind of stuff that was going on, people. Now, why is this important? It's important to understand that what you get involved in, the energy, it locks you in life. That's exactly what's happened here. And from amongst these things, Farazdaq once says about, he says about Jarir, he's dissing him, and he says, he has this, he says to him that, he says, قالت كليب. Kulayb is the tribe of the sub-clan of Jarir. He says, قالت كليب قمشوا لأخيكم ففروا به إن الفرزدق آكل. He says that his sub-clan are saying, you know what, we better run away with you know, Jarir, because Farazdaq's going to eat him up. He's going to eat him up. And he says, Anal, like, check this out. He says, Anal maut alladhi huwa dhahibun binafsika, that I am death that will take your soul. Fanzur kayfa anta muhawilu, that what can you possibly do about death? He says, Anal Badr. Now check these lines out, because Farazdaq becomes really proud of these lines, and he claims that Jarir could never outdo him on them. He says that, Anal Badr, I'm like the full moon shining in its glory. He says, Yaghshi taraf عيوني فلتمس. He says that the way it would just, you know, the light, it overwhelms the eyes of the full moon. He says, فلتمس بكفيك يا ابن الكلب. هل أنت نائل? He says, if you try to reach it, you son of a, he calls him son of a, al-kalb is a dog. Like, he says, you son of a dog, that could you reach the moon if that's what you wanted to do? And check this, going back to his dad. He says, وَتَرَكْنَا جَرِيرًا وَهُوَ فِي السُّوقِ حَابِسٌ عَطِيَّةَ هَلْ يَلْقَى بِهِ مَنْ يُبَادِلُ. He says, we left Jarir in the market, and he said he had his dad with him, Atiyya, and he was hoping to trade him into the market. He's hoping to trade his dad. فَقَالُوا لَهُ رُدُّ الْحِمَارَ فَإِنَّهُ. And they said to him, take this donkey back. إِنَّهُ أَبُوكَ لَئِيمُ الرَّأْسِ وَجَحَافِلُ. He says, this is like such a wretched donkey. They said, take this donkey back. Look how twisted his face is. And this is what he's saying to Jarir. And Farazdaq, what he does is he takes this oath that, you know, this poem, I've killed it. And he takes in one, he claims that his wife is divorced. He does the talaq thing, that according to some stories, that Jarir could never come out with an answer for that, because especially the line, he says, Ana al-maut, I am death. He says, Ana al-maut alladhi huwa dhahibun bi nafsik. That fanzur kayfa anta muhawilu. That what can you do about death? So this line had Jarir, it had him consumed mentally for a while. And as it happened, they once met up in the royal court, all of them, these three. And this Bedouin comes in, and Abdul Malik, these three poets are there. The Bedouin doesn't know these three. And he asks, the king asks this Arab Bedouin that, what's the best line of kind of flirtatious poetry that you've ever heard of? So he quotes a line of Jarir. He quotes the one, he says, إِنَّ الْعُيُونَ الَّتِي فِي طَرَفِهَا حَوَرٌ يَقْتُلْنَنَا ثُمَّ لَمْ يُحْيِينَ قَتْلَانَا. That he says that those eyes that have that, they kind of, that they have the kind of, almost like where the word hur comes from as well, they have in the kind of dark, the kind of, the blackness is incredibly black and the white is incredibly white, and they have their eyes like this. They murder us, and then they don't give us another death. They don't bring us back to life. So he quotes this line, which is of Jarir, but he doesn't recognize Jarir. He just says this to the king. So the king says, okay. He says, which line is the most praiseworthy line that the Arabs have said? And he quotes this other poem, which we've done previously, where which is also from Jarir, where he says, Alastum khayra man rakib al-mataya, what is it? وَأَنْدَ الْعَالَمِينَ بَطُونَ رَاحِ. He says to, we've done this story before, he says to Abdul Malik, that ain't you the most generous of the world when it comes to giving and so on. He goes, that's for Jarir as well. And then he says, okay, which is the greatest diss track, the diss poem? And he says that famous line, that غُدَّ الطَّرَفْ إِنَّكَ مِن نُمَيْرٍ فَلَا كَعْبًا بَلَغْتَ وَلَا كِلَابٍ, because this had absolutely shut down an entire powerful tribe. And then Abdul Malik says to him that, do you know, all these three are for Jarir, belong to Jarir? And he says, yeah. He says, do you recognize Jarir? He says, no. He says, that's Jarir right there. And you see, what had happened prior to this Arab walking in, the Caliph was saying that, you know what, if I could determine, I've got a prize here, but I want to give it to the most done poets of you. So who is it going to be? And they were kind of like all in this little argument. And then this guy comes in and he seems to be just rating Jarir. So Jarir, as you can imagine, is like, oh, wow, wow, over the moon. And at that point, Farazdaq also mentions his epic line that I am death, people. That how do you answer that? He says, Ana al-maut alladhi huwa dhahibun binafsika fandur kayfa anta muhawil. That what can you do about death? You know, I am death. Is there anything greater than that? So Jarir responds to him. Wah, wah, people, wah. Oh, reply. He says to him, Jarir says to him, he says, Inni dahru yufnil mauta wa dahru khalitun. فجئني بمثل الدهر شيئا يطاول. Allah. He says, your death. He says, I am time. Immemorial. Dahr. Time. And he says, and time can even eradicate death. It says, so bring me something that can outstretch and outlive time itself. Allah. And you know, they say that poem, that even the caliph then said, you know what, that oath you took about the talaq, I think the talaq's done. This was another musibah, by the way, back then. And the fiqh books are so full of this. What they would do is they would just, anytime they want to prove a point, they would just say, right, if this isn't like this, then my wife is divorced. Famra'ati talik. This is what they would do. It's like they've got nothing better to say. Honestly, the fiqh books are full of that, which is a calamity in and of itself. But the reason I was saying this is, and I thought this story is important, is these people, although they produced poetry, and the poetry has lived, it's lived on and eternalized them, but they spent almost half their lives in this kind of this hate relationship. And it was so ironic that they became so attached to one another during this time, because even though they are rivals, but you see, it's like a yin yang, that one exists by its opposite, that in enantiodroma that you have, that we spoke of, that things with the opposite potential. Just as in life, that you see, when we have struggles, the struggles are like the yin to the yang. They carry, they balance, allow us to balance the goodness and the achievements that come. And these two got so embroiled in this that, you know, when they reached after 40 years, Farazdaq, he died, he must have been in his early 90s. When he died, Jarir said a eulogy, a poem, eulogizing him, praising him. He said that لعمري لقد أشجى تميما وهدما على نكبات الدهر موت الفرزدق. He says, Wallahi, he says, it has tore down Tamim and wounded us. In spite of all the calamities that we've been through, the death of Farazdaq. He says, لَقَدْ غَادَرُوا فِي اللَّحْدِ مَنْ كَانَ يَنْتَمِي إِلَى كُلِّ نَجْمٍ فِي السَّمَاءِ مُحَلَّقِ. He says, they have left in this grave today a man who had reached every sky, every star in the sky that was visible. Allah. And they say he himself, Jarir, within possibly 40 days of Farazdaq's death, died as well. Sometimes what consumes us, it ironically keeps us going.